So Upper Deck sent me Legendary Annihilation, and I was like, hey, I really appreciate that, but I don't have the base game. And so they sent me the base game, as well as Messiah Complex and Doctor Strange, and here we are. Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co., and this is a review of these three games, or more specifically, Legendary, with these three expansions. Legendary is a game that I dove into quite some time ago, a long time ago. See, I played Legendary a long time back because I heard a lot of good things about it, I wanted to dive into it, and I dove into it, and I don't remember that much about it, but I remember feeling that it was good, but also not a game that I felt the need to continue playing, and so I played it and moved on from it. The flip side is I've heard over the years that Legendary is a game that is played best with expansions, that you really want to develop and augment and improve the experience, and so this was a good opportunity to go ahead and dive into the game, try out a few expansions, see how those adjust my experience around Legendary, and then, do this video and all of that stuff. So, let's talk about this game, let's talk about Legendary, let's talk about what the expansions add, let's talk about all the things, and then of course the review part of this stuff where I tell you my opinion of the game, and whether the expansions have made this game a keeper for me or not. Legendary is a deck building game. It's a deck building game that has a little bit of controversy around it because of the nature of the fact that it is kind of a semi-cooperative experience. It's a game which you're going to build out your deck as you try to take down the evil mastermind, as you try to deal with the specific scheme in play, and you have bystanders and wounds and villains and henchmen and all these things that are slowly invading from the villain deck, slowly making their way through the cities as you try to build your deck and then play your cards in the right combinations to ultimately take down the baddies. You're going to be playing cards like in most deck building games to be mindful of your economy, to buy more cards and improve your deck, and then also playing cards with strength in order to actually fight and conquer the bad guys. Along the way, you have to be mindful of different effects they'll have, their ambush effects, what happens when they go through the city, what happens when you fight them, whole bunch of different effects going on the various cards from all the different sets you play in, just abilities, tons of abilities and text-based things left, right, and center, from the mastermind and the way they deal with the game, from the scheme you'll have. There's tons of schemes in this game. Once you have the base game plus expansions, you have way more schemes than you'll ever reasonably be able to go through, all of them providing a different twist, because there are scheme cards that show up in the villain deck that'll be shuffled in based on the configuration of players and all that you have, and that's printed very handily on the board over there. And whenever those scheme cards come out, they will have an effect depending on the scheme that you're playing against. So you'll have those scheme twists, and then X, Y, and Z will happen, X, Y, and Z to be determined by the actual twist, the actual scheme you're playing with. Along the way, you have bystanders that will be slowly carried out of the city by the various villains, and then you're going to be mindful of this hero deck, which is a combination of, a variable number of heroes depending on the player count you're playing with, and you have a bunch of heroes that you choose before the game, you shuffle those in, you compose the hero deck, which is effectively the card market in the game, and you're going to be building your deck around those heroes. Rinse and repeat until you eventually take out the mastermind, and this is where the semi-controversial part comes into play, because strictly speaking, according to the strict interpretation and reading of the rules, you are all trying to take down the mastermind. If you do not, you all lose, and if you do, whoever gets the most points wins. Which feels a bit weird, because I'm not entirely sure what the ideal way to play Legendary is, although I've gone back and forth. You see, my initial dive into Legendary years ago had a few issues with it. We'll talk about that more during the review part of things. But one of the aspects was I immediately wrote off that semi-cooperative aspect. I was like, no, forget that. We'll defeat the mastermind. We'll call it a day. We either win together or lose together. I'm not doing this whole semi-co-op thing. I don't like semi-co-op in games in general. I do sometimes like games despite semi-co-op, but as a mechanic, I always have the problem with it because, that's a video for another day. I don't like semi-co-op. It's a very controversial mechanic. We're not heavily going to go into it, but the general idea is you could have a player kind of decide to tank the game and then operate selfishly if they're not winning, a whole bunch of issues around it. Those issues haven't actually been prevalent here, but it felt weird to work together to take down the mastermind and then have a player win. So I didn't really love that. Whereas this time round, diving into a second time, I've actually leaned into it a bit more as a competitive experience. I played this solo, and we'll talk about the player counts and all those stuff, but I'm really kind of rambling here because I'm kind of moving into review without a firm structure in place, although we'll get to all of that. But I kind of leaned into this one more as a competitive experience this time round. When I perceived this less as a cooperative game, and I perceived it more as a competitive experience where it's all about building your own deck and taking down the bad guys, and ultimately I view these as simple victory points, and these as better victory points. Think of them as the provinces and dominions taking down the various mastermind cards. When I think of it more as a competitive experience, it actually changed my perception of the game and my interactions with the game, and for me, slightly improved it, which is interesting because if you go online, if you go to the forums, if you go to people's opinions of Legendary, it's all over the place. Some people think this game plays best as a cooperative experience. Some people think this game plays best as a competitive experience. And some very wrong people think this game plays best as a semi-cooperative experience. Those people are just wrong. It's either cooperative or competitive. The whole semi-co-op thing just doesn't practically work. I mean, in theory, if you're playing it competitive, technically you're playing it semi-competitive or semi-cooperative, but it just feels competitive at that point. In any case, let's go ahead and dive into the review of this game. I cover the how to play, the basic overview. The base game is going to come with a lot of content, and the expansions come with more content, as you might imagine, being expansions, but more importantly, the content is escalated in a few different areas. The villains sometimes get more difficult. I say sometimes because I have not played as every single mastermind, so I cannot speak comprehensively, and any and all parts of this review are specifically around the base game and these 3 expansions. I have not played any other content from the Legendary universe, or even the Legendary offshoots, of which there are a lot of offshoot systems, from Alien vs. Predator, from James Bond, from Firefly. The system has been very, very well developed across a lot of IPs. The Marvel one arguably being the most notable or famous, but I've heard a lot of good things about the other ones at the same time. But let's dive into this one, starting off with ease of play. So, ease of play, the game is actually incredibly easy to teach and dive into if you're coming at it from the mindset of somebody who knows what a deck building game is and how it operates. It's very easy to explain the sequence of what happens, of the villain card slowly marching out, of what you do when a wound comes out, what you do when a bystander comes out, what you do when the masterminds, the masterminds attack, their master strike shows up. All the sequences are very easy to explain how they differ and differentiate themselves from a standard deck builder, assuming you're teaching it to someone who knows deck builders. If you're teaching it to someone who does not know deck builders, then you will have to first get them up to speed on how that works, on the nature of building out a deck, on when your deck is empty, you shuffle it up and you discard, and so your deck is slowly getting stronger and stronger, starting off with only 12 cards, drawing 6 cards a turn, and then that's going to be 2 cycles, but then every time you add cards, your deck gets slightly more powerful, slightly better, and whatever. As far as the actual setup and stuff, the setup is arguably the most fiddly part because it varies definitely based on player count. The nice part is they have that listed over here, although I do wish that they had the solo aspect set up over here as well, because if you're playing it solo, you kind of have to, you have all this information on the board as to how to set up everything perfectly, and then if you're playing it solo, you have to go to the rulebook instead. I don't think it would have taken that much extra to print it on the board. Once you're having it there, kind of just have both. Minor nitpick there. What I will say as far as the rules is the rules from a reading standpoint are unnecessarily complicated. Maybe it's because I'm coming in from the stance of knowing a deck builder, so I might be walking with that bias, but I felt the rulebook itself was a little bit overly in-depth on areas that didn't feel like they needed to be explained, or just, the rulebook was fine, but the teach is actually significantly easier. It's a very easy game to teach, very easy game to dive into, especially if you know deck builders. As far as player count, this is a 1 to 4 player game. I have played this game at 1, 2, and 3 players. I'm not a huge fan of the solo play, although this does go back to my aspect of feeling like I like it more as a competitive experience. For the most part, I feel like defeating the mastermind is not that complicated. The decisions I make along the way, not that hard. There are masterminds and schemes and combinations therein that are certainly more difficult, but I would say as a solo game, I just felt this was less satisfying. I've played it a few times solo now, both the base game and with the expansion. I like it much more as a competitive experience playing it with multiple players. But 2 and 3 were both great. I have not played it at 4, so I cannot comment on that player count. I imagine it'll be fine, a little bit more downtime thrown into the mix, but nothing too significant. As far as what I like, don't like, and can see others not liking about this game, starting off with the theme. I like the theme. I like Marvel as a theme in general. When you slap Marvel on a board game, assuming the board game is not terrible, I like having that theme in my games. And then the art across the board in general, I like. I do know there are critiques around reusing art on multiple card types. I think that's more of a problem in the base game, but I don't know if it's been overly fixed in expansions and whatnot. But overall, the art's fine, the theme's fine, it does all those things. I mean, it's not fine. I like those things. And I like the accessibility of it as well. I mentioned this game is easy to dive into, and it very, very much is. If you know what a deck builder is, this is such an easy game to teach and table. A little bit more complicated as you start adding more and more content to your box, and you have to start figuring out how you want to store your legendary collection in a way that it is very accessible, because the more stuff you add, the more sections you have. But again, it's pretty simple. You're going to have your mastermind, you're going to have your villains, you're going to have your henchmen groups, you shuffle all that together into your villain deck. I mean, the mastermind doesn't get shuffled, the master strike gets shuffled. You're going to put your villain deck over there. Then you just grab a variable number of heroes depending on the player count, shuffle those up, and you're good to go. It's very simple, very easy to dive into and get started, so the accessibility is very, very high in this experience. The fact that you can play it cooperatively or competitively, or semi-cooperatively, I guess if you want to go that way, does work for me. I like the fact that you have that variability. While I personally prefer thematically diving into it as a competitive experience, especially if you are playing against masterminds that are harder. When you find those combinations of schemes and masterminds that really present a challenge, then I like it as a co-op game as well, because for me, the biggest problem is, especially the base game, which was my first experience and exposure to Legendary, I just found too many of the things too easy. And so just going through the cycle of building out my deck to not really feel like there's a challenge along the way, that part never worked for me if I'm viewing it cooperatively, versus it does work for me if I'm viewing it competitively. So my overall opinion there is I like the variety you have. I like the option that you have to dive into both, but I like competitive more because regardless of how difficult the mastermind or scheme is, then I feel like I'm building up my own deck and trying to do my own thing, versus if the mastermind's too easy, then it's only fun competitively. As far as variability is absolutely huge. There's a ton of content for this game. I don't even understand how people have full Legendary collections and dive into anywhere near the amount of combinations or things there are. There's so much expansion content for this game. This universe is absolutely huge. I feel like even just having the base game and 3 expansions gives me more than enough content for a long time, unless I was playing this game every single day on a regular basis. There's a ton of content. The hero variability, the enemy variability, the masterminds, the schemes, the henchmen, the villains, all those things. There's an absolute ton of content to the game. And then the combos. This is one of those things where the base game and expansion are going to differ for me a bit. I found that once you add in the expansions, you get more opportunities for interesting abilities, interesting mechanics that they have that get added in. But there are opportunities to have fun combinations between the heroes, between the way one hero will work with another, between cards within that deck will work together as you build out your deck. If you play base game alone, based on my interactions with the base game, I had less of that fun combo-tastic goodness. As you add in more expansions, there's more potential for those combos, although it is very dependent on which heroes you use and whether you actually get the opportunity to get those cards and whether those cards come out at the right time. But there are opportunities to have cool turns where you're like, I do this, I look at the top card of my deck, I draw that into my hand, I go ahead and look at the top card of the villain deck, oh look, it's a Master Strike, I'm going to purge that from the game. Whole bunch of fun things you can do as you mix these together, especially once you start throwing in those abilities. As far as what I don't like, the base game does not feel interesting enough. Not in the thematic aspect of the characters, there's a ton of thematic aspects, but in terms of the abilities, the base game to me felt too simple. The schemes are great, those were always fine, I always enjoyed the schemes, but the basic hero cards, for the most part, just didn't feel nuanced enough in what they did, that one of the reasons I walked away from my first experience walking away from the Legendary series entirely was because I just didn't feel the base characters were interesting enough. It was like you really need to get those expansions to escalate both the difficulty of the game as well as the complexity, the interactions, the combos, all of that. So that's my first complaint, which is more focused on the base game, but more focused on the base game. My other complaint, which is also relevant to the expansions, is going to be that I don't feel like I make enough interesting decisions in this game. Especially considering I kind of prefer this as a competitive experience, I feel like the card market is just not large enough or interesting enough to really have a ton of interesting decisions. In general, a bias I have is there's 2 kinds of deck builders. There's deck builders with fixed card markets, like Dominion, where you have like 10 cards and you're building your deck around perfect information of how to build your deck, and I tend to like that style a lot more because it gives me a lot more agency to really feel like I am in control of how my deck will develop across the game. The variability will come from which cards you add into the mix, but then after that, it's up to me to build the perfect deck and not up to the cards that happen to be available at any given time. Because there are only 5 cards available at any given time, and then at any given point you may not even be able to afford all of those cards, and then at any given point you may even have duplicates of those cards in play, it means that the decision tree of what you can do in this game at any moment is a little bit more limited than I would like. Variable card markets and deck builders, I enjoy the experience without loving them as much as fixed card markets for that specific reason. There are exceptions, to be sure. Legendary is not one of those exceptions in that aspect. I feel the market is a little bit too narrow in what you're being offered at any given time, thus restricting the degree of decision making and actual planning I am doing around how I build my deck, and for the most part, it's what I do in the moment. I almost wish this market was twice the size, or alternatively just a fixed card market instead, although because of the way the hero decks are constructed, I don't think that would really work in Legendary. But that's my biggest complaint against the system. While I've learned to embrace it more as a competitive experience and diving into it that way, I just want more decisions around what I do, as opposed to feeling like there's an obvious choice at the obvious time. It's not always the case, but more often than not, I felt like I was just picking the card that made sense given what was in front of me. As far as what I can see others not liking, first of all, that semi-co-op aspect. While it hasn't been a huge issue for me here, if you don't like semi-cooperative experiences, if you kind of want to dive into this as a cooperative game, but then someone's going to get points, I mean, you could just forget that exists, literally. You can either play it competitively or cooperatively and just call it a day, but if you don't like the semi-cooperative experience, that's something worth mentioning. Also, the duplicated card art. I kind of touched upon this already, but if you don't like the duplicated card art, and the reason I bring that up as something I can see others not liking is because honestly, there's enough art in this game that it doesn't bother me at all. I just know that I've seen a lot of people talk about it, but like, oh my gosh, they reused art in certain cards, and I'm like, there is so much art left, right, and center, it doesn't bother me. There's plenty to look at over here. At the same time, it might bother you because clearly it bothers some other people. And then lastly, and this is a big one, is the game, and it doesn't bother me for a reason I'll get into in a second, which is the game does strongly incentivize linking certain hero types together, thus limiting some of the freedom you'd have around how you build your game out. See, you have a lot of these cards that will award you for playing different cards from different sets or different cards from different types. You play an Avenger, you get this. You play a Fantastic Four member, you get that. And if you play a specific nuanced aspect of the type of character, you get a bonus. And that does mean that you're very incentivized to build out your hero deck in certain ways, often using cards from the same types. Use 5 Avengers, use a whole bunch of Fantastic Four people, use a bunch of X-Men, use a bunch of whatever that all match up, and that does to some extent limit the creative freedom you have as to how you build out your deck. The only reason that doesn't bother me, because it is the kind of thing that would bother me, is because, speaking for myself, I've had, the amount of content I have versus the amount of plays I'm actually getting out of this, I still feel I'm getting a ton of different nuanced options. If this is a game that you're playing more, and if this is a game that you're not heavily going into, like getting a whole bunch of expansions, then over time that can be an issue. Over time, having 3 expansions won't have the creative freedom of actually having full 3 expansions which you can mix together. Rather, you'll have some, cards you can use from this set, some cards you can use from that set, and you'll have a little bit less flexibility. So it can certainly be a problem, not a problem for me personally based on the way I'm experiencing this game. As far as what the expansions add, because before we dive into final thoughts, let's talk briefly about the expansions. We have Doctor Strange, which is their newest expansion. We have Annihilation, which is their second newest expansion. And we have Messiah Complex, which is their third newest expansion, I guess. And these are all going to be giving you different things. I believe, which one of these? Messiah Complex is... We have, one of these is, this is one. I believe Annihilation is a bit of a continuation, an extension of their Fantastic Four expansion that they had in the past. There's going to be a bunch of abilities in this one, from focusing, which is where you can basically have a card that lets you pay your resources to activate the ability on the card as many times as you want. You're going to have the man and woman out of time concept, which is cards that basically you can use them again. You can get a second use out of them. You're going to have momentum, which is the aspect, you're going to have momentum, which is an aspect of cards coming out and rushing forward through the game. You're going to have a Conqueror, which gives various villains the idea of them being stronger in certain areas. Bunch of different abilities like that, including Galactus, who can destroy certain zones on the board. We have the Messiah Complex, is going to give you clones, cards that effectively double, let you building out, grab more and more cards, either from the villains or from the heroes. We're going to have Shattering as a mechanic, which lets you half the enemies as you attack them. You're going to have Tactical Formation, which focuses on the cost value of certain cards. If you have like 2 4s and a 5, you can do X, Y, and Z. You're going to have Prey, which are various villains that will be attacking you and targeting you and executing their finished prey action in case you don't deal with them. You have duels between 2 characters, head-to-head aspects. You have Veiled Schemes, which are schemes that are basically hidden, where you'll have the scheme is going to be kind of veiled, and you'll introduce and add another scheme from your sets later. And then we have Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange is likely my favorite from these 3, although I don't know if that's mechanic-based or if it's because of the fact that I just really like Doctor Strange as a character. But Doctor Strange has a few different aspects. They have demonic bargains you can make, where you can basically do a demonic bargain, turning over the top card of your deck, and if it's a card that actually costs more resources as opposed to a starting card, then you're going to get a little ding against you, and either way you get the results of the bargain. You have the Astral Plane, which is a new zone where villains will enter, and the next time a villain enters the Astral Plane, it immediately shoots them out, which adds a degree of immediate tension to the board as you wonder, okay, are we about to have something new come to the Astral Plane? Rather than having 5 turns, you kind of have, what's the next card, or do I have to deal with this character right away? You have things like that, and you have artifacts. Artifacts are a big part of the Doctor Strange expansion, which are basically cards that can stay in front of you, and you can use them and discard them at any point to do their ability, which gives you a little bit of flexibility to have fun little combos of a card that is situationally beneficial, but you can wait until the situation in which it is beneficial. Those are some of the mechanics. I probably didn't get all those. I'm going mostly from whatever here, but there's a bunch of mechanics in these things over here, in these expansions over here, some of which have been in past sets. Like I believe artifacts have been in past sets, although there's a new type of artifact. I don't remember the name for it, but there's a new type of artifact in this set. I believe Man and Woman Out of Time were in prior sets. Focus was in prior sets. So some of these, and I don't know that from playing prior sets, I know that because the little expansion thingy that told me how to play the game said these things have shown up in prior sets. Because if you're wondering, like, how does Alex know? Because he said he hasn't played those other games. I have not. Anyways, let's move on to final thoughts with Legendary of this game, how I feel about it. My opinion of Legendary has improved, but I'm still not completely sold on it. First of all, let's talk about the base game. Base game Legendary, I, for the most part, feel it is too simple. I feel it is a good introduction to deck building. I think it's a great game as far as bringing people into this hobby, as far as giving them an accessible game, a solid theme, and giving them a fun way to experience a deck builder as you work together to defeat the mastermind, and depending on what your preference is, either play that cooperatively, competitively, or semi-cooperatively. You can go through that. I think it's a good introductory game, but one which leaves me just not interested enough in what it's doing. When you add the expansions to the mix, I do enjoy it more. The expansion cards give you a lot more mechanics and things going on, a lot more interactions that add more nuance and add more interesting decisions. Man and Woman Out of Time, building your deck around those cards, having a card that can show up again, having a Man and Woman Out of Time card with focus in it, with focus where you can look at the top card of the deck and potentially get rid of the Master Strike. Could be very helpful. Also very situational. So is it a good thing? Is it not a good thing? The way you build out your deck when you have more options on the table, when you have more nuanced options, it certainly improves the experience, although I still feel very held back by having only 5 cards to buy from at a time, which more often than not does not give me the tools I need to really feel like I am building my deck with the level of agency I would want. That's my biggest critique against the system. While the system itself upgrades a lot once you start adding expansions to it, overall, I just want to feel like I'm actually building my deck and not that I'm just feeding my deck the cards that show up that are options at the time. I wish there were more ways to clear the rows. And again, expansions might have more things like that, but I wish there were more ways to clear these rows, to get rid of cards, to put new cards out, to slowly build your deck, to maybe search through the deck, getting the right card. I wish I had more agency around how I build my deck. I've said that like 4 times because that's my biggest complaint against the system. Overall, Legendary as a base game, before you get into the expansions, would be a 3 out of 5 for me. I think it's a solid game, but not one that I'm rushing to dive into. Legendary with expansions is a 3.5 out of 5 for me. I like it a lot more with the expansions and with the extra nuance they provide, while still being a game that I see why it's popular, I see why it's liked, I enjoy some of the aspects that it's giving me, while wanting a bit more out of it in terms of my personal gaming tastes. And that's basically my review. If you want other game recommendations, there's going to be 2 here that really stand out to me. First of all, Marvel Champions is obviously going to be the thing that's compared very heavily against Marvel Legendary. Marvel Champions is a game that I like a lot more in terms of the level of deck building and agency as how you build your deck. Not deck building within the game, deck building before the game. From Fantasy Flight, tons of expansion content there as well. Just a lot of stuff, a lot of great art, great mechanics, great theme, great stuff as far as Marvel Legendary. Marvel Champions, a different spin on a Marvel deck building game, because one's deck building in the game, one's deck building outside the game. And then secondly is going to be Thunderstone Advance. Thunderstone Advance is going to be a game that feels very similar in terms of Marvel Legendary, in terms of what it's doing, in terms of how you both build out your deck, you try to build out your things as you deal with various enemies that are in the way, kind of feeling similar, like a similar sense of working together against a common enemy while ultimately being out for yourself, which is, like I said, the way I prefer to play Marvel Legendary. Until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you found this review helpful, and as always, have a good one.